costing of biodiversity projects across Europe. So over to you, Tom, if you want to start sharing your slides.
Yep. Okay, thank you very much, Tree. Thanks, everybody. So I'm presenting this on behalf of two European projects. So Europa Bon, which finished a couple of years ago, and Mambo, which is ongoing, hence it's all Mambo branding. This is actually work that Tree supported me on when she was a postdoc with me at the University of Reading, where I'm currently based, which is in the Department of Sustainable Land Management in the School of Agriculture, Policy and Development. So I'll dive right into this. As you're all no doubt aware, there is a significant issue of global biodiversity decline. So we're talking a significant decline in natural ecosystems. A very large proportion of species are already threatened with extinction. And there's substantive decline in elements of nature that are most important to indigenous people around the world as well. So biodiversity loss is it's a major challenge. There's even a recent MOD report pointing out how it's actually a security risk to the UK, which was quite an interesting outcome. And within the EU, there's been a lot of different policy over the years, from the Birds Directive in 1978, which is arguably sort of a landmark in terms of biodiversity conservation policy, up to the more recent nature restoration regulation. And other other related policies like the Sustainable Use Directive, ecosystem accounting, regulation of invasive species. And these regulations create obligations for member states to protect biodiversity. So they're not just being asked politely, they actually have to do this on threat of fines. And the Common Agricultural Policy and shoot, I've immediately forgotten what CFP, the Common Fisheries Policy, sorry, both include measures to reduce the pressure on biodiversity caused by farming and fishing, respectively. And the Nature Restoration Regulation now does include legally binding targets for pollinators and forests, along with birds, grassland butterflies, and protected habitats. So the issue, though, is that conservation efforts are challenging. So there's a lot of different drivers of biodiversity loss, including things that are very global in scale, like climate change. And the EU's invested literally billions into agri-environment schemes, but there is still actually quite limited evidence for their effectiveness at a very large scale. And a part of that is because biodiversity data, which is incredibly important for improving the sustainability of how we manage landscapes, is very scarce. And the experts that are out there are often being very stretched. As part of the work I did in Europa Bon, I was talking to the guys who monitor bats in Latvia, for instance. And they were saying that because of the construction of wind farms, they are so overburdened now doing environmental impact assessments, they barely have time to keep up with all of their bat monitoring. And public engagement with biodiversity is still relatively low in many countries. It's probably best in sort of the UK, in the Netherlands, Belgium, and parts of France. But when you get into Southern and Eastern Europe, engagement with monitoring really drops off for a lot of cultural reasons. And also there is, as mentioned, there's an economic dimension to this as well, which is really recognised as part of the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was introduced in 2022, and it's the UN's framework that recognises the risk to human society in both cultural and economic terms. And it's aiming to mobilize $200 billion a year in finance for biodiversity by 2030, a lot of which coming from the private sector. And the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive now actually requires companies to report on their biodiversity impacts and risks. The business school at the University of Reading has been asking quite a lot of questions of us about this. And there are new instruments coming online, like green loans and biodiversity credits, which are cheap loans for companies who commit to do things that support biodiversity. But there is a lot of issues of, are they actually funding anything that works? And transparency, reliability, accountability, these are things that are a real concern for a lot of businesses. A lot of them don't actually engage with these financial instruments precisely because they're not sure if they can really trust what is being done, and they don't want to get stung for engaging in greenwash without really understanding it. So this is where biodiversity monitoring, and I'm sure a lot of you at JNCC are very familiar with this. So biodiversity monitoring is so critical to actually addressing a lot of these issues. It's understanding what our baseline population is. Been very heavily involved in the EU pollinator monitoring scheme, for instance, and one of the biggest challenges in that is in a lot of countries we simply don't have a baseline. But it's important for understanding what the main pressures are and how these different pressures interact, what the potential risks are for people and businesses. Is what we're doing actually useful? And then building upon that and actually saying, can we make predictions about the future? And a lot of the data that we do have has been either accumulated by a lot of different short-term research projects, funded for 2 to 5 years, or opportunistic recording by volunteers. And a lot of this is very spatially biased. It's down to where it is available and where's easily accessible. In the case of volunteers, where they want to go. Volunteers tend not to want to go to places they're not likely to see species. Although we have been able to show some quite important trends. So these are a couple of research papers that use species occurrence data to plot the decline in insect pollinators in the UK. So on the left is a long-term trend of decline in bumblebees and hoverflies in the UK. And on the right is it's a now 20-year-old paper, but it still sort of shows the general change in species richness just based on species occurrence records for bees and syrphids in the UK and Netherlands. There are some more well-supported systematic monitoring schemes that will undertake a structured method every year, and often sampling in places that people don't necessarily want to go, but it's important to try and capture them. And these things like the various BirdLife organizations, the European Vegetation Survey, WICE, which is part of the Water Framework Directive monitoring requirements, the European Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, and LUCAS as well, which does an awful lot of monitoring of habitat, but also the real treasure trove for LUCAS is the soil monitoring, which has proved to be an amazing resource. But the problem is support can vary a lot between countries. During the course of EuropaBon, we spoke with a lot of people from the different BirdLifes, for instance, and the support that the Danish BirdLife gets is significantly greater than the support that the Latvian and Lithuanian ones get, for instance, just because you've got a more engaged community there. And in some cases, European Butterfly Monitoring Scheme there is nothing long-term established in some countries at all. And this means that even regular data collection can have many gaps. So this is the EU Butterfly Monitoring Scheme's regular data collection, and it just shows the UK, the Netherlands, we're very well covered, southern parts of Sweden, but then you get much less transect density as you go into other parts of Europe. And even sort of marine monitoring programs, there's a lot more around the UK than there is in the Mediterranean, even though there's actually probably more biodiversity in the Mediterranean. So there's a lot of holes that still need to be plugged. So this begs the question, why are we not monitoring so much? And a lot of that comes down to funding. Whenever we talk to anyone, it is simply we do what we can with the funding that is available to us. So it begs the question of why there is this underinvestment in monitoring. And a part of that challenge is that proper monitoring is a long-term investment, and a lot of governments around Europe are not really interested in committing to that. Also, it needs people with quite uncommon expertise. You can't, you don't just grow taxonomists on trees. Citizen science is not free either. There is a bit of a perception that it is, and it absolutely isn't. Effective citizen science absolutely does require having some investment in staff to keep it running and the infrastructure to keep it running. And the costs are obvious, whereas the benefits are rather obscure. So with the expense is clear and it's upfront, but is it actually generating any sort of monetary return? Is it benefiting what you're trying to do? That's much harder to actually directly link. So as part of Europa-Bon, we surveyed 68 European monitoring organisations. We've already sort of alluded to some of these. And we asked how some of these key factors affected them. Some of the big challenges they pointed out, because of a lack of long-term investment, public budgets, they are usually agreed on sort of a 1 to 3 year rolling basis. So it's really hard for them to actually plan and retain staff. Even if they are getting enough money, they're often finding that, well, we can't guarantee someone a job. And there was one monitoring organization saying that they have got absolutely loads of data, but because they can't guarantee anyone that they will have a job in a year, they can't actually hire a statistician to do any analysis for it. So they can only do the most basic reporting. And also, because of that, you end up with, because we can't guarantee people funding, we have to hire contractors, and contractors can be quite expensive. And there often isn't this sort of commitment to maintain infrastructure like servers or reporting forms, web forms, etc. And also just a lot of organizations, they then have to turn to trying to get research projects, which means they're having to constantly invent new reasons to go out and sample the same thing, or they have to tweak their methodology, which in turn affects the data quality. They're not really doing what they'd like. It's the only source of funding out there. Limited expertise is also a problem. I've mentioned earlier about how bat monitoring in Latvia is kind of struggling because of the amount of environmental impact assessments they have to do for wind farms now. And this sort of highlights a bigger problem, that it's only a handful of highly qualified experts that can do a lot of monitoring, and they can be expensive to train, and often it's not a very well-paid gig either in a lot of Europe. And taxonomists are becoming very rare. There was a IUCN red list of European invertebrate taxonomists a few years ago, which showed that European invertebrate taxonomists are critically endangered. And also they often need some special training. So diving, bird ringing, this is not stuff that you can just do. You need to have that specific training that needs to be paid for, and it needs to be done on a reasonably regular basis in some cases. And individual experts are often, as I say, spread quite thin because of other work. And also, as mentioned, citizen science is not free. Volunteers, absolutely can do incredible work and can become absolutely some of the best experts out there, but they still need proper administrative support and reliable data infrastructure in order to actually generate good quality data. And they are still experiencing costs. An example from the survey in particular was in Serbia, the price of petrol had gone up so much that the bird monitoring were really struggling, because the volunteers still wanted to go out, but they literally couldn't afford the fuel anymore. So it was a real challenge for them. And they're very hard to recruit. And overwhelmingly, feedback is critical to retaining them. They want to feel like their data is going into something and it's making a difference. And the most successful monitoring schemes are the ones that have got people who are paid to continue to have that continuous dialogue with the volunteers, and particularly around the start of a season, showing them big fancy reports from all the data they collected in the previous year is excellent at energizing them and getting them excited to go back out next year and feeling like they've really contributed to something. And as mentioned earlier, they often don't really want to go to low diversity areas, and a lot of volunteers also don't want to do certain methods. With pollinator monitoring, for instance, the work we've done as part of several projects, volunteers don't want to kill bees. So yeah, so we don't want to do certain methods like pan trapping, etc. And also, costs are obvious, but the benefits are obscure. So it is often dismissed as too expensive without a real cost analysis. And one of my best papers is because DEFRA said that pollinator monitoring was too expensive. So I've spent several years categorically proving it wasn't. Monitoring also, it does compete for conservation funding, and there is a debate within the literature about how much we should be allocating funding to monitoring rather than actually doing something about biodiversity loss. And there is a serious argument to be made that investing too much in monitoring can mean that you're watching things die rather than actually doing anything about it. And even compared to actual conservation action, there's very few obvious immediate benefits to monitoring, although I hope I'll be able to convince you that there are some quite substantive ones by the end of this. And also, monitoring activities can in turn encounter some political resistance. Something else we found from the surveys and the interviews is certain governments really push back against bird monitoring, because if you've got a rare bird population, it stops you developing in that area, and they want to develop for tourism. One of the monitoring organizations actually said if they had extra money, they'd like to hire a lawyer because they're spending so much time dealing with bird poisonings and other environmental crime. Other countries very much, our government hates us except when our data supports what they want to say, and then they suddenly love us. So take that what you will. So it's all a bit negative at the moment. So the question is, going forward, how do we better understand the costs of monitoring? So the methodology that we've developed over several projects, particularly the EU pollinator monitoring scheme, we look at costs in different levels. So we look at the data collection, the workflows, and the coordination costs. We also look at different stages at which monitoring takes place. So we talk about upfront investment, so new technologies and things that can be transferred between different countries. The establishment costs, so those upfront year one costs you need to set up a monitoring network, and then actually maintaining that, which is often the legwork of the data collection. It's inputting the data, it's the year-to-year coordination. And we also break our costs down into two different types. So we look at material costs, so how much it costs for everything from nets and test tubes and cameras, all the way up to gene sequencing equipment, and most importantly, the people. And our costing protocols do include staff of different levels of training. So it does include everything from junior researchers all the way up to senior professors. So with the EU pollinator monitoring scheme, for instance, we have been doing costing estimated from a power analysis, which gives us the number of sites that we need to monitor in each country. And as you can see, the cost breakdown is like so. A lot of it is very much on the field staff, because there's a lot of legwork involved in going and actually doing the bee, hoverfly, and butterfly transects that are required by the monitoring scheme. And things like data management, coordination, these scale very well. So a bigger scheme will have a larger proportion of field staff and some fuel costs, but very much the other costs will scale quite well with a bigger monitoring scheme. So, having 10 times as many volunteers does not increase your coordination costs by 10 times. So, as say, staff costs were more than half the 10-year costs. But the biggest issues with this were identification. So that costs also includes identification outside of the field. So that's 10% of the costs, as you can see, and that gets much higher in the Mediterranean because you've got a higher species richness. So you've got more species that as an individual could be. And also they've got limited taxonomic resources in the first place. So some of them, about 80% of what they catch, our experts that we were working with could identify pretty much straight away. And then 20% they would have to go to a capital city and spend 2 days in a museum trying to work out what it is. So that was EU ponds, and this was one of the things that we contributed to getting that scheme up and running, and it is as part of the nature restoration regulation. So with Europabon, we looked at the total costs of a European-wide biodiversity observation network, which hence the name. For this, we had 84 essential biodiversity variables that were identified through various policy and workshops that we held over a 3-year period. It was originally only going to be 20 or 30, so my workload somewhat ballooned as part of the project, but it was worth it. It was really interesting and engaging. And we used this classification of essential biodiversity variables because it's very relevant to policymakers in Europe. They do really like this because it's much easier for them to understand if they're not experts. And as you can see, actually a bulk of them were sort of species-related EBVs, but also we had a lot of community compositions in there, and actually quite a surprising number of ecosystem structure EBVs. So in addition to those, another thing that Europabon was to produce was a blueprint for the European Biodiversity Observation Coordination Centre, or EBOC. And that, I'm delighted to say, has been funded, and I believe a tender has just been accepted on it. I'm not sure who the winning bid was. I believe it was Suke. So the idea of this is it's a centre that will handle the high-level needs of European monitoring. So that's everything from coordinating between different member state actors, mobilizing data, sorting out issues of integration and interoperability so that data can actually talk to one another, which is a big problem in the WISE and Water Framework Directive monitoring data. Design and promote new schemes, build capacity, harmonize some existing methodologies, and also produce bespoke analyses and visualizations outside of what is already demanded by things like the Habitats Directive. So we estimated the costs for all of those activities in addition to the costs of actually collecting and analyzing all the EBV data as well. So in the end, we ended up doing 68 of the EBVs. Some of them were a bit too complicated to do and a bit too last minute. But we also did a comparison of 16 shared sampling networks where the assumption is you would go out once and you would do multiple different methodologies to collect data from the same place at the same time versus having 68 completely separate networks. And we did this with both high and low numbers of sites in order to capture variance. These were not estimated from power analyses. We had to sort of do fairly back-of-the-envelope calculations for these. And we also included all of the relevant EBOC activities to support each EBV. So where we knew there was interoperability issues, we costed in how much it typically costs to do an interoperability plan based on previous experience from EU ponds and some of the bird life work that's been done over the years. And our sort of 16 shared sampling networks for things like lakes, rivers, marine fish, terrestrial mammals, marine invertebrates, birds, priority insects, other insects, including invasive species, citizen science through apps, things like, monitoring invasive species, but also phenology, soil monitoring, herpetology, plants, and even genetics. And in total, the costs from the shared sampling networks were between 5.7 and 14.4 billion euros per year. Whereas if you do them as completely separate sampling networks, and you do 68 disconnected networks, that balloons to 14.6 to 117.4 billion a year. So co-location really pays off, at least in our crude estimates. And mammals and insects were especially costly to monitor. A lot of that is down to the massive effort that's needed to identify them, either from photographs or from specimens. However, some of the higher technology monitoring methods that we could cost at the time were often substantially cheaper. And we also worked with various experts to identify where there are opportunities for new methods as part of this. So citizen science actually came out as being a really seen as a key opportunity space for developing new monitoring efforts, but also things like aerial remote sensing and genetic monitoring were also quite heavily suggested, even for these sort of ecosystem service focused EBVs. And this is where Mambo comes in. So what I've been talking about so far is very much work we did under Europabon. And Mambo is a project that essentially follows on from that really focuses on those novel technologies. And it's got 6 core aims: to develop and test AI species recognition, to develop new metrics for habitat conditions, promote automated habitat mapping, co-design and test tools with end users, build a community of practice to then actually apply those tools, and test combinations of new and old tools to see how effective they are, and to show some of the work that's been done. So we've the project's been involved in things like improving the capacity to identify and count plants from a quadrat. This is by PlantNet. They've done some really cool stuff, including literally driving cars along roadways and photographing the flowers on the verges as they go, and then automatically identifying what's in them from that, which is a phenomenal amount of cover at a relatively low effort. And also, we've worked very closely. Observation.org is represented directly in the project through Naturalis. So a lot of the work they've been doing in Mambo is improving their recognition under the hood. And also we've been looking. Sorry, I lost my place for a second there. So as an extension of this, we also did a specific project comparing the costs of traditional camera traps versus a fully autonomous camera trap system. Any of you who've done mammal monitoring will know that it's quite a tedious process. You have to constantly go out, change batteries and SD cards in cameras, and then manually upload your data and then sit and pick through it and identify everything. The system that was developed at the University of Amsterdam is using a fully autonomous camera, so it's solar powered and it has a 4G data transmitter, and it's loaded automatically to a server, which then organizes the data, and then it can be directly added to an AI to identify species in there and at least chuck out things that are blank. So we did this for a sample network that we assumed was 64 cameras over a 30-kilometre year for a 10-year period, and concerning 4 different mammals. So we included all aspects of costs we could think of. So the actual cameras themselves, obviously the autonomous ones are more expensive. Setting up the workflow, again, that's more expensive with the autonomous system. Training the AI, but also we included some costs for manually validating the AI just to make sure that it is actually getting it right. Because, of course, the best way to improve an AI is to tell it when it's wrong. And in total, what we found was the difference between the costs were pretty substantive. The traditional system costs way more to set up, not because of the materials, but because the sheer amount of time that you have to spend constantly gearing all of that up. And then it's actually, no, sorry, I realized those headers are the wrong way around. That's the one thing I didn't fix. Sorry about that. Yeah, so the automated system is more expensive, but its annual costs are much lower because you don't have to go out constantly, you don't have to change the batteries, and you don't have to constantly recover SD cards. You just have to go out a couple of times a year just to make sure everything's ticking over, fix things that got knocked over. And in total, it cuts costs by about 43%. And one of the biggest things about this is the sheer amount of staff days that it saves. So 24 days a year for a fully automated system versus 75 for a traditional system. That's a 51 day per year saving, and researchers can do a lot in 51 days. This was a bit of a factor of the fact that we were doing this in the Netherlands, where wages are quite high. So this difference will be smaller in some other countries where wages are not as high. And it's also a bit restricted. You can't necessarily do this everywhere because it needs sunlight, so it's not suitable for monitoring all mammals, and needs to be in an area with at least a good 4G connection. So in truth, we probably need a bit of a mix of both. But another technology we've been working with in Mambo is on acoustic sensing, so continuous monitoring of birds, for instance, simplifying the monitoring of bats. As I say, this is a very specialized area of monitoring that a lot of, there's very few experts around for many species. And also opens up the possibility of monitoring things like the abundance of grasshoppers and crickets, because you can potentially tell their numbers from the amount of sonication that you've got in an area. And also we've been doing a lot of work with remote sensing. So how much is the habitat? What's its structure like, using LiDAR from drones, and also doing this sort of habitat condition mapping, again, using drones. So these are very much coming online now. Mambo is winding down, so it will be finishing in May of this year, and we're expecting quite a surge of publications soon. But in addition to that, we talked when we talked to monitoring organizations about what technologies they would also like to use. eDNA libraries also came up as things that people really wanted. Also, machine learning support for workflows. This is especially important to volunteer organizations. Having something that is some automation to checking data is actually something people really wanted. And also having more tools for detecting pressures. This is something that we touched upon a little bit in Mambo, but didn't go into too much depth. It's things like using drones to detect chemicals in the atmosphere and pollutants. So it also, novel technologies generally present us with a lot of new opportunities, from lowering the barrier of entry. And I actually have a PhD student who is doing her whole project on how AI apps can increase engagement with biodiversity monitoring more generally. Just generally engaging the public. This is, some of you may be familiar with AMBER. This is a monitoring project run out of Swansea University, and it's just looking at river flow and barriers in rivers across Europe using AI, not even using AI apps, just using apps to record them, because they're really hard to spot from satellites, and it's actually an incredibly useful project. But also developing new tools. So this is from Nature Forecast, and based on data that's harvested from things like Flickr, they built this model predicting the occurrence of high-value mushrooms across Europe. And they can actually do daily forecasts of that. And they do daily forecasts of quite a few things. And sort of last but not least, actually having good structured monitoring does have some economic benefit to it. These are all fairly back of the envelope calculations, but we had a quick crack at them, from making decisions to that will better protect natural capital, from pollinators to recreational angling, which is actually huge in some parts of Europe. Reducing the risks from environmental hazards. The damage caused by ticks is actually pretty substantial across Europe every year, in terms of person working days lost to things like Lyme disease. Flooding also is something that can be can be better understood through proper monitoring of habitats. As mentioned, actually efficient use of research time and budgets. A lot of the data that we've got is harvested from small research projects. That is not an efficient way of collecting long-term data. And having that data available allows us to do more things with it, and allows us to focus our ecological efforts on answering more fundamental questions about species ecology. And also actually having a good monitoring scheme and that is well supported by something like EBOC is absolutely what the business sector is crying out for. It's that sort of quality assurance that the business sector really needs to actually start properly investing in biodiversity monitoring. These are very back of the envelope calculations, but these are some estimates of the benefits of doing all of these different monitoring schemes in Europabon over a 10-year period. We estimate it around 25.2 billion a year, which is way higher than the costs of co-located monitoring. So efficient, well-designed monitoring can easily pay off. So yeah, just to wrap up, so generally biodiversity monitoring in Europe is underfunded, but it is badly needed. Understanding costs properly can help identify ways of making monitoring easier, cheaper, or better. New technologies can reduce costs and improve productivity, but as with the example of the camera traps, it's not a silver bullet, and we do need to consider mixtures of monitoring methods. And working across disciplines is absolutely critical if we're to properly engage people effectively. So that's it from me, but I'll leave the slides up in case questions pertain to specific ones. Sorry if that overran a little bit.
No, you're absolutely fine on time. That was perfect. We do have quite a few questions come in though, so I will get cracking on those right now. The first one is, you mentioned about the MOD reporting that biodiversity loss poses a risk to national security. Can you explain why that is?
I've immediately forgotten.
I actually have the link open in my internet, so I've put the link to the assessment there. So if anybody wants to go away and have a look at that, it's a brief but depressing read, I would probably say. Yeah,
it's largely due to sort of reducing the resilience of things like food systems to external pressures. So if we were in a situation where, say, we were embargoed, having weak biodiversity means that the food system is under a lot more pressure, and there is much more risk of to food security in the UK. Other examples like that. I have read it, and of course I've immediately forgotten it.
Yeah. Next question. You mentioned that citizen science is key for essential monitoring data. How do you think this can become more effective and streamlined?
So this is also what the PhD student I mentioned was is also doing. It's the other half of her PhD project, is actually seeing how things like apps can improve the quality of the data that is collected as well, and making sure that that data is useful to actually answering some of our bigger research questions. So it is much more of a matter, I feel, of well, and from the experience of the people that I've spoken to as part of all this research, that a lot of the challenges in interoperability and making sure that that data flows very nicely and neatly, and that we can get a good system in place that people can see their data and really engage with it and get some good feedback from it. So yeah, I think it's a matter of just encouraging people to engage with effective monitoring strategies and not just being totally opportunistic.
Excellent. Next question is, how do you assess or include error in your assessments of cost?
We include a lot of variability in those costs in terms of just how much prices are likely to vary from country to country. So our costing estimates do include separate. We cost each country out separately, so the variation wages is captured in there to some extent, but inevitably there's no way of doing an exact science for this. I've been trying for many years as part of EU POMS, and basically the best thing we can do is include a range of possible values. And the thing with costing is it's always meant to be indicative, and we never really know absolutely how things turn out. I mean, we're definitely getting better, but I think the only way to include error is to include variability and just let people and just be transparent about it.
Yes, that makes sense. Thank you. What solution do you have to ensuring monitoring has enough funding and that this isn't just siphoned off to conservation efforts?
I think things like EBOC are essential in that regard. So it's down to actually having some dedicated funding and dedicated standards for monitoring, having minimum viable standards. I think because that really does put a floor on the amount of money that you have to spend, and things like ensuring that there are proper staff in place to do the analysis that you actually need to do. Again, by mandating things, I think that is crucial. Stopping it being siphoned off is tricky and not something I've directly asked people, but as I say, I think just minimum standards are the way to go.
I'm going to ask you slightly out of order because there's another question which I think also links to that one. Do you have any concerns that a greater emphasis on automation might mean that governments put even less importance on scientists and funding?
So yes and no, in the sense of all this automation is useful, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't tell you what any of this data actually means. And this is why I like our study with the camera traps, because it saves 51 days of a postdoc. It's not going to obsolete that postdoc, but it gives that postdoc 51 more days to actually do something interesting with that data. And I think obviously with automation of anything, we need to obviously be careful that we're not squeezing out an already limited taxonomic expertise in particular. But I think the way that improved technologies save money is not truly obsoleting people. You still need people to actually do something with that.
Okay, that feeds actually nicely into the next question, which is species level identification always necessary, or can surveys use coarser taxonomic levels and still be useful?
Generally, yes. For a lot of the essential biodiversity variables we're talking about, they don't necessarily need species level data. It's just preferable. But it depends on sort of specifically what the EBV is. So if you're just sort of looking at, general abundance of broad guilds of pollinators, and that is the monitoring objective, absolutely that works. But if you're wanting an EBV that is telling you about rarer species, you do need to then go down to species level.
Makes sense. What are the main barriers to co-location?
So I think a lot of that is down to expertise and what expertise is available where and when. And also just a lot of these things are funded in isolation, and that's where you end up with siloed expertise. So you may have a soil expert and a vegetation expert who are in the same city, but they're in two different institutions paid through two different streaming, and they've got two different sets of objectives. So again, it's coming back to this question of harmonization and interoperability. It's about making it's aligning the objectives and sampling designs. And there's actually a bit of a push to align EU POMs with Lucas, for instance, to try and do a lot of the EU POM sampling in Lucas sampling squares so that they can then produce complementary data.
I think you've already partly spoken to the next question, which is, are there limitations to how beneficial co-location can be? E.g., they can save money by monitoring multiple taxa, but the protocol is not ideal for a given taxa.
Yeah, this is, and that's exactly it. We were assuming that in our co-location costing, we were assuming that the taxa were monitored with appropriate methods, but that does mean for some co-location networks, it didn't save a lot of money because you're having to do quite a lot of different methods. You're only really saving on a bit of time and fuel.
Right. We've got two more questions, so we're on track to finish bang on time. Do you think that leaving expensive automated camera traps out is too much of a risk because of theft and vandalism?
It is absolutely a risk, and in our cost calculations, we did actually factor that in. So we factored in a 5% loss every year. So we assume that you have to replace 5% of the cameras in the network. There is also costs for things like cages, anti-theft stickers, things like that included in there. But yeah, it absolutely is. It is a real risk, and possibly could become more of a risk for things like solar power because of the rare earth metals in them.
Right. And the last question that we have is, what would be an acceptable return rate for funding monitoring? Presumably funders need monitoring to be better than just paying for itself.
That's an interesting question that I haven't really thought about, or I haven't specifically asked anyone about. I think ultimately there's a return on investment in two ways. There's a monetary return on investment, and then there's a return on investment in terms of achieving the objectives you actually want from monitoring. So if you're investing in monitoring to make sure that the habitat restorations you're doing are conserving the rare species in question, and it demonstrably helps you improve the number of breeding birds, terrific. That is a return on investment because you're getting more breeding birds. And there is a whole it's starting to be explored, but there is a whole branch of mathematical analysis called value of information, where you actually sort of see whether you're making better decisions with and without certain information, and that has been applied to marine monitoring. Yeah.
Excellent. That's all the questions we have for now. That was an incredibly interesting talk. Thank you so much, Tom. And it's really nice to see some of the work that I did a couple of years ago actually feeding into something like this. So thank you very much. And thank you for everyone who came along to the talk for giving up your lunch break for our science talks. We appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thanks very much, guys.